Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books and Chit Chat with All's authors and the aging and amazing. We would like to welcome you here tonight to discuss a beautiful book that I had the privilege of reading. I was the member of our acquisitions team who somehow found Carolyn or she found us. I don't remember how that worked. And how it works is the authors who may be interested in having their books presented by All's authors, they'll make contact with us or we make contact with them, and then we ask them to send us a book. And I was the one who received Carolyn's beautiful book, Walking with Faye. And I'm going to tell you that it was gripping, that I loved it. It was I have to say, it was one of the best ones that I read. Her story was so personal. She shared a lot, and I don't think she held any punches back. And the relationship with her mom and the turmoil that they encountered was right there on the page. And what really got me at the end is that it happened during COVID. It was, I think, the second book that I read that had COVID in the story. And now we've gotten a couple of others, but it was just really new. And her caregiving journey and the end of her mother's life during the pandemic was just unbelievable. It was unbelievable. So congratulations on that, Carolyn. You did a really great job on your first book. It was your first book, wasn't it?
It was. Thank you, Marianne.
Yeah, I just really enjoyed it. I'm glad to meet you, and we can talk more about it.
I've been following you, and it's so nice
Mhm.
to see you in person finally. It's almost 2 years.
Yes.
And Denise signed on to the book club, and for an interesting piece of trivia, Denise is in my book. She is the Denise,
Oh.
the walker, the person who walked with my mom when I couldn't, because every time I
Mhm.
would try to walk with her, she would wanna jump in someone's car and take off. And Denise is also the impersonating Faye person on the front cover of my book because I didn't have an
Oh.
actual photo that I wanted of my mother and I. So we went about getting something that was very close and then having it computerized. And she's impersonating Faye.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Carolyn? I know that you were living in Georgia and you retired, moved to Idaho, and
And then
the opening to your book is really like, I mean, it's such a great hook. I mean, you could write a book about writing hooks because you said that you kidnapped your mother. It's like the opening line of the book is how you kidnapped your mom. So can you just tell us your story? Tell us how this all came to be.
I moved to Atlanta, Georgia in my early 20s, and I was born and raised in upstate New York, where my parents still lived. And after a couple of Christmases coming down to Georgia to visit me, they decided to move nearby. Not too close because the city was nothing they were interested in, but they moved to rural North Georgia. And it didn't take more than just a few years. My husband and I at the time had made plans to retire to the West. And we were really, really nervous to tell my mother that we were going to be moving because my father had recently died. Once we got to Idaho, though, it was a daily conversation with my mom, coffee with Faye, basically. And I started noticing things, repeated stories on loops, mysterious man who she was sure was watching the outside of her house. Things like that were starting to prickle up my ears a little bit. I was very busy trying to ignore them, chalk them up to the quirkiness of my mother getting older. Until one morning, I received a phone call very early. It was from her local sheriff calling me to tell me that he'd been fielding quite a few phone calls from concerned citizens that she was driving on the wrong side of the road and erratic and cutting people off, that sort of thing, and asking me to do something about it. At that point, I still knew I wasn't going to be able to do something about it because I was just not going to be able to convince my mother from 3,000 miles away to give up her driver's license. So I really didn't. I just kept hoping it would get better on its own. And then I got another phone call from the Department of Health and Human Services saying that my mother had been admitted to the hospital. This was weeks later. She had fallen and her hairdresser discovered her on her floor from a missed hair appointment. And when they released her from the hospital, she had no one to call. She couldn't remember any numbers. She couldn't think of anybody who could come get her. So they assigned her to a nurse who brought her home and found my phone number on her refrigerator. And that was the fire that was lit under me because this nurse was livid. She accused me of being a bad daughter. She told me that if I didn't do something, the Department of Health and Human Services would step in and do something. I didn't know what that was exactly, but it was enough to get me out to Georgia. I was embarrassed, I was
Mm.
mortified. I had these daily conversations with my mother. I had talked myself into the fact that she was fine. I saw her on an annual basis. Her house was dirtier every year. Her kitchen was more cluttered every year. I wasn't allowed to clean anything when I got there, but I did my 4 days and went back home and felt like I had gone and seen my mother and everything was reasonably fine. She insisted it was fine. She
Yeah.
wanted absolutely no intervention and she wanted nobody to tell her what to do and she liked her life. So I happily agreed to that. You look back on that and you say, gosh, Caroline, why couldn't you have seen all this? But at the time, I'd never even had the discussion about dementia with anybody. I didn't have any friends who had family members with dementia. I didn't use that term. We called it, we called it old age senility, or we called it quirkiness. Those were the terms I used.
Wow. I do want to make a comment though. What you said about the nurse, she brought your mother home. Then was it the nurse from the hospital or
Yeah, it was a caregiver. They called it DFACS, Department of Family Services, and they assign you with a home health care nurse. She was assigned
Mm.
to see my mother and visit her once a day to make sure that she was taking her meds and basically upright.
Yeah,
Mm.
because I'm a nurse and I was a discharge planner or a case manager from a hospital. That is not something that we would have ever done, is to send an elderly
It was
person home
a
like
county
that.
services hospital
Mhm.
contracted with a county services organization.
Okay. So we have heard stories like this, obviously, and through our experience with the Alls authors. I think that a lot of people, they don't want to see what's right in front of them because it creates change.
Absolutely.
We don't like change. And also, we're not here to tell our parents what to do. They tell us what to do, even when we're adults, right? A lot of us, we're still, and I think you said that in the post that you wrote for us on our website about being a good daughter. I was the good daughter my mother raised. Don't
We
make.
absolutely had that dynamic.
Mm.
I was her daughter. I was subordinate. I listened. I did not talk back and I did not provide my opinion about anything. That's
Mhm.
just the way it was.
And you're the only child.
No, I'm the youngest.
Oh, so where are the others?
Well, my brother and my sister happily let me take over. They had been reporting to me also like, mom doesn't sound, mom sounds strange, or she's saying this, or she's telling us that. I don't think it's true. They just didn't know what to do with her. I didn't know what to do with her, but I just needed to get her close. So I did that.
Were your siblings still living up in New York then?
My sister lived in New York and my brother lived in Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh,
He had
okay.
followed me down a couple of years after I got there and just had no interest in providing that kind of help to my mom, to say it plainly.
Mhm. I think that is also a story that I hear often. Sometimes it's all of the kids get together, but more than likely it's maybe one gets elected. Sometimes it's the short straw. I know for me, in my case, it was I was here and my parents were 10 minutes away and in California, and everybody else was, across the country. So it's interesting how someone gets elected to this challenge.
I took it on and I was told by so many people that I should be upset. And I remember feeling confused by that because I was relieved. They weren't interfering, they weren't telling me I couldn't handle it one way or another. If either of them had flown out to my little town in North Idaho, I would have had to drive 2 hours to the airport to get them. I would have had to find a place for them to stay, trying to deal with my mom. So it was a relief to me
Yeah.
eh, that they kind of just held back and let me handle things.
Mhm. Yep.
Sometimes if you have to have a committee all the time with your siblings, it really makes it hard to get anything going. So as challenging as it might have been for you, maybe that was also it's nice to feel a little bit more autonomous and like, let me take care of this, let me take charge.
My sister was always available for me on the phone, and there were so many times in the earliest days that I called her just sobbing, over something my mother had said to me that was, unbelievably cruel and unusual. So I would call her and she would just listen, and it was good. It was really good.
One of our other authors said his brother took on the task of the parents, and he said, "My job was to take care of my brother." So those people who maybe don't want to step into the caregiver role, you can always be the source of support for the caregiver.
Yeah.
Yeah, that works well. So what happened when you decided to swoop in and take mom and put her on a jet and bring her across the country?
Yeah. All hell broke loose, right? Yeah. My sister did come down to Georgia from New York and drive my mother back to her place while I cleaned out my mother's house, which took a whole lot longer than I had planned, and then drove a U-Haul trailer with my mother's things back to North Idaho. Roxanne got on a plane to fly her from New York to North Idaho without any ID because we couldn't find any of my mother's ID. And we were able to find a photocopy of an expired driver's license and an old Medicare card and a photocopy of her birth certificate and FedExed to New York. And they lost the package, finally found it again, and had to go to the airport and go to the security office and see if they would let them on the plane. And they did. But they got to Denver and my sister called me. I was still unpacking everything from the U-Haul van the day before they were to arrive. They were at Denver. They were going to have a red eye in and then spend the night. And my mother wouldn't come out of the bathroom stall. She locked herself in there and told my sister she wasn't going any further and she knew what she was doing. So I just stood there in my mother's new living room, surrounded by boxes, and I just said, "Well, she's yours then. If you can't get her here, I can't help you." And lo and behold, they arrived the next day.
So your mom didn't know that she was being relocated.
It was a summer vacation. We were bringing her out to see me just to spend a little bit of time. And then she was going to go home. And that's how we got my mother to do many things that I needed to get done. She believed just enough to be able to learn to lie to her, which was terrifying for me because I never lied to my mother. So, therapeutic fibbing, as they like to call it, I became pretty good at that, including getting
Really,
her in her first assisted living home.
it's really hard to do that, to switch in your head. I have to now tell my mother something that's not true. And
You're going to get caught. You're sure of it. And then all of a sudden, she believes you.
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
And so by this point, had you determined or been told or been given the diagnosis that she had dementia?
I tried when she got here. We had to start over with everything. She had diabetes and we couldn't find any of her medications. And we had lost her current Medicare card. All of this had to be fixed. And it's a long, tedious process that I'm sure you know well about. But I was working on getting all that fixed, including getting her a physician here. And I called ahead and said, "There's something wrong with my mother. I believe she has, Alzheimer's. And I'm going to tell her that we're coming for an annual exam. And I would like you to see if you can find out if she does. And please don't say anything to her because she's very suspicious." And that is exactly what they said when we walked in for her appointment. "I understand you're here for a cognitive neurological exam to see if you have Alzheimer's." And I just, I was floored. And my mother looked at them and she said, "Oh, no, I'm not." So, and Denise knows well that my mother's attitude toward many of those things. So she was non-compliant is what they called her.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And how frustrating it is for those of us who are caregivers to like be like, you were supposed to be on the same page with me here. We were doing something that they,
Licensed physician.
You think that they would know better than that's just astounding.
It is in this day and age.
Right. Right.
This
Yeah.
was 2012. I don't know if that was, everything is kind of going at breakneck speed, isn't it? They're making so many discoveries or the beginnings of a discovery. They're starting to pinpoint the plaque, and
Hmm.
calcifications and linking it to diet from 20 years earlier. And these are things that are just now coming out, aren't they? So even in 2012, when you talked with me earlier before we started recording about authors, I was searching for that book. That's the only reason I wrote this book, was because the whole time I was trying to care for my mother, who was as slippery as a snake. I couldn't figure out what to say when she fired that next tennis ball at me. How was I supposed to respond in a way that would not inflame her and would not cause her to mistrust me? And yet, all I wanted to do the whole time was defend myself. And I wanted to make it go away. No, mom, I'm not stealing from you. But also, there is no man breaking into your house at night and moving all the magazines around. Even when she was convinced that there was, how did I explain to her or how did I diffuse that situation? I had no idea. So I went to the library and I read and I read, and I just couldn't find a book that had enough daily interactive examples of Joe on the street, the average person, not a 36-hour day. That book was fabulous, but it was, to me, geared more toward a further along stage of dementia, whereas my mother was in the early stages. Believable half the time. So that was just enough to keep me so off balance that I didn't know for sure if she was pulling my leg or if she really believed what she was saying. And was she really being mean to me? Or was that just the dementia talking? Every day was this teeter totter for me. And I feel I definitely handled it badly.
well, yeah, I can relate to how you feel that you handled it badly, but I mean, I also really resonate with what you're saying about I couldn't find the book. I couldn't find the information. And this one was like the 36-hour day. This is kind of it, but it wasn't where we were. And so you wrote the book that you needed, which is, I think, where a lot of Al's authors are. But how wonderful that you're sharing this, because this is exactly what people do need, is that it does feel really slippery and not knowing. I mean, our people can still be very articulate and sound like they're very lucid. And yet the next moment, they are not there. They're in another thought pattern. And so it's challenging.
One of the most frightening things for me during that time was the perception from others that I was being overreactive and controlling and was inserting myself into my mother's life unnecessarily. I was receiving those kinds of looks from people when they would have a conversation with my mother that sounded perfectly normal. I was also receiving judgment from some people who felt like I wasn't getting involved enough and I
Mhm.
wasn't taking control and I was making her do, or making her safe, which was an impossibility. She wouldn't stay inside her house. I would drive away and look in my rearview mirror and I would see her coming out that front door with her hat pulled down tight. She was off and running, just waiting for me to pull out of the driveway.
So where would she go? And she would.
To take a walk. My phone pinged all day long from people saying, "Hey, Carolyn, your mother's on the South Hill. She's walking down towards Safeway. Hey, Carolyn, your mother's walking up the South Hill. She's got two grocery bags in her hands and she's all stooped over. Hey, Carolyn, I've got your mother in the back of my car. She flagged me down and I pulled over and picked her up." I mean, there was any number
Oh,
of
wow.
those situations. But what I did was I put my name and my number on her house key. She didn't have an address on there because I was afraid somebody would, come into her home with her. But that woman would take that house key out and show it to anybody and say, "Look, this is my daughter. And she'd show it to them and they'd just dial me. And that was saving grace for me in my small town. That was how
Uh,
I often had eyes on my mother.
it's like you had a little set of spies there.
And she was just off and running. I think, at the time, I felt like she was doing it to spite me, like, what is she doing? I just put her to bed and off she goes.
Oh my gosh.
I never knew. And that's the other struggle I think I see a lot of people have is they think that they're doing it on purpose. And I don't believe that that's necessarily the case. I think that they think in their minds, my mother thought, I'm escaping. I'm going home. I don't like it here anymore. Any number of things I think were going through her head. And all I could see was she was defying me. I told her to good night. I'll see you in the morning. Stay here. And she defied me.
Mm.
Well, and that fear for her safety too, like, oh my gosh. And so
And
you,
how bad do you let it get? How much of a rope do you give her before you do have to, get in there?
so you bring her from Georgia by way of New York, and she's in Idaho with you now, and she's in her own home somewhere near you, right? Relatively near you. I guess it's a
Oh, right
small
up the
town, so
street.
right
Yeah.
up the street. And by this time, you've kind of connected with doctors. And where did you go from there? How did, because I think this is a really hard thing, right? When do we know when that's the next level? Like, what's the next thing? And this is 2012. So, and really, we think that I mean, for me, I feel like 2012 was like last year, right? But over 10 years ago, right? So it's, what is it, 14 years ago? And a lot has changed. So, yes, we're knowing a little bit more, but
The Alzheimer's Association didn't even have their whole website up like it is now.
yeah,
There wasn't the 24-hour hotline. There weren't all of the answering
yeah,
sessions there were no podcasts on dementia. None. Right.
right.
And literally a dozen books, in my library. I mean, I could have, I suppose, online, but even online, it wasn't 12 years ago, wasn't the online presence, that we have
Right.
now.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
where it went from there was I spent the summer. I mean, I got her here in March, I believe. And by October, I had her in an assisted living home. The one thing that I promised her I would never do, ever.
Mm.
And it was my ex-husband, Sam, who called me one day and said, Carolyn, I just saw your mother. And he said, you're not doing her any favors. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you're going there for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but there are 24 hours in this day. And your mother is getting herself into trouble because she's alone the rest of that time. And you cannot keep eyes on her like this. She needs to be surrounded by people. And it just sort of like, it just rang a bell in my head when he said that, letting her down and breaking my word. I was getting her surrounded by people because she was a danger to herself at that point. I had to tell her that her roof had a leak and she couldn't live in that house because they had to tear the entire roof off to fix it. And we needed to put her somewhere like a hotel for just the amount of time that the roof was going to be repaired. And she bought it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
No. But what you're describing right now is a sort of a conundrum that so many people, so many daughters and sons and spouses run into. This, I made a promise I wouldn't do this one thing.
Yeah.
But then you find yourself in a place of, I don't see another solution. That doesn't always work for everyone. It could be, why is this person in my house? Or they get annoyed that someone's there, or it's just astronomical compared to what you might be able to afford in assisted living. There's so many different things. And so I think it's very hard. I guess I want to ask you, how did you feel about that, having made a promise? And then, not that you broke your promise, but you changed how you were caring for her. How was that for you?
Well, I left all those little pieces out because it would take forever for us to have this conversation, but I did do all those things. I did have somebody come. Well, Denise, for one thing, Denise and Ginny, another friend of ours, became my daily walkers and they split their time up. So my mother had 2 visits almost every single day from those two people. Then I tried a senior companion. We have the senior companion program in the next town over, and they came to our town. I tried that until my mother accused her of stealing from her. And I tried another woman who my mother stopped answering the door as soon as she saw her come up to the front within like the first two visits because she decided that she didn't like her. I tried these things. You just keep trying different things and sinking. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how to put it any other way. I was a physical and emotional wreck. I was breaking out into tears at the post office. I would be stopped at our local grocery store from somebody who said, "Oh, how's your mom?" And as soon as that happened, just the deluge of tears coming out. I saw my physician for my annual exam, and we never did get to my pap smear. She prescribed Prozac for me after having a 10-minute conversation with me. I remember that. I remember getting that prescription filled at the pharmacy, sitting out in the parking lot and taking two with a cold cup of coffee from my console because I was ready to get this. I was ready to feel better,
Yes.
and I was just going to try anything. You just find yourself in these positions and they're astronomical.
To desperation. It is.
Desperation is a great word for it.
Yeah, it's really hard.
And we're all telling the same story, aren't we? I mean, within reason, we have these levels that we go through that I feel like, when I see somebody now on the street and they say, "Oh, Carolyn, my husband just got diagnosed with dementia." I mean, I stand there and I look at them and I don't even have to say a word. I just listen because out it comes. And I'm listening to somebody as though I'm looking in a mirror. It's a husband and not a mother. There are different personality factors involved, but those raw emotions that this person is feeling right then and what they're going to continue to feel, my heart breaks.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So during this time, you're then working. Is this when you were working still in real estate?
Oh, at that time, I had multifamily homes. I had some rentals. I was a landlord. I had a gift gallery, rather a group. It was called the Groove Studio. It was an art gallery. So I was having shifts there. Every busy person's life. Describe it.
Were you a journaler? Because I noticed you started to like maybe take some notes. Was journaling something that was productive for you or helpful?
It was one of my assignments from one of my counselors. Start writing things down. And part of writing my book was from retrieving old emails. I had written emails to girlfriends like, "You're not going to believe what my mother just did today." Those sorts of things. And some of those email outclips are in the book, which they're just some of the funnier ones. Uh, but yeah, it was my stack of emails that I kept and some journaling that I had kept because I realized at the end, as I started writing, sometimes I would get to a chapter and I would be all caught up and I would wait for the next phase story to happen until the inevitable end when I ended the book with mom's end of life. But there were times that I thought, "Oh, I wouldn't have even remembered that thing that happened between us if I hadn't written it down or had sent an email to somebody about it."
A lot of the books come from that. A lot of the
Yeah.
books that we have in our collection are written through journaling and communications with other people. It's
Yeah.
really helpful.
Yeah.
I think it's lovely that you said you were working with a counselor. Was this somebody from the Alzheimer's Association or some other, I mean, whatever support group you joined, it sounds like that was helpful for you? Yes?
It absolutely was. They became what I called my AA meetings.
Mhm.
They were Alzheimer's Association meetings, and it was the first and third Thursday of every month at 1 o'clock at our Panhandle Health District. And we just had this little conference room, and there were usually about five of us. I found out about it on the library bulletin board when I was there looking for a book one day. And I walked in the first day, and there were, five of us. And I sat down and I fully thought that this wasn't going to help me because this was going to be a group of people who just weren't going to be going through what I was going through. And I listened as they went around the table, and I basically heard the exact same story of something that was going on with me all the way around the table. And by the time they got to me, I was just reduced to tears. And I didn't really need to say much my first meeting because of everything everybody else was contributing. And I went home that day and just thought, oh my God, when can I go back? How far away is next Thursday at 1 o'clock, the second Thursday? I went all summer to that group and I learned all about how to get a power of attorney. I learned how to get my mother's Medicare card reinstated. I learned how to get a bank account set up for her. I learned how to respond to her in certain situations. And I learned how to journal. And they were the ones also, along with Sam, nudging me toward getting her a place to stay.
Well, wonderful. You got a lot. You sound like you got a lot out of that.
Yeah.
And those are all the things that people need to know about, and they don't know. They don't even have a clue.
Yeah, our little town of 2,500 people had an
Wow.
Alzheimer's Association group.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So important.
Well, you point to a couple things that I think caregivers easily forget. One, definitely the support group, so important, however you might be able to find it. And then the other one you mentioned earlier, just going to see your doctor. I mean, caregivers a lot of times run themselves into the ground. And so luckily you had a physician who was like, well, we're going to take care of some of this. Yeah. And I hear stress, Carolyn. So we're going to take some anxiety and stress off the table because I think that's really critical. And so good for you that you took that step to we talk about self-care and it's not just bubble baths. It's also making time to take care of your own health.
And what? I have no time. I mean, I remember that. I remember people saying, so what are you doing for self-care, Carolyn? And I was like, self-care? What? What is that word? Yeah, but by the wayside, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah, it really does. And again, I think that phrase, while I really believe it's super important for everybody, it's gotten co opted into some stuff that maybe isn't really doable for everybody, right?
It needs to be better defined.
Yes.
Yes. Like you said, the bubble baths. That's the first thing I remember thinking when people said that. Like, I don't have a time for a manicure and a pedicure, I don't have time for a bath.
It's just a time for you to like step away from that part of your life, I think. So,
Right.
and to do something that you enjoy, which could be a manicure or a bubble bath or just going to the library or getting your annual physical or having coffee with a friend. Or
Yeah. My
go for a walk.
self-care was like a Denise and Ginny situation. Like in the book, when I knew that Denise was with my mom walking her for that hour, I knew that I had an hour for free. And same with Jenny. Jenny would show up and she'd usually text me and say, okay, I'm here with your mom. I'm going to stay for an hour. I would just melt, like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm good for an hour. And that
Mhm.
was my self-care.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
how was it that your mom ended up in the nursing home at the end?
At the very end in the nursing home, because
Yeah, like what were the steps from she got it to the assisted living stage and then fill in the blanks to the end.
yeah, in our town, we had kind of three options. We had the first one that I sent her to. I changed the names in the book, and now I can't remember what I called them, and I have to be careful because you're not. I really don't want to name the names, but she went to the first one, and I needed to remove her. There were personalities with the staffs, and oh my gosh, Christy, you're talking about being in the industry. I think there's a need in the industry for continuing education for caregivers that are in the professional role because I saw so many personal interactions that were handled through their personality and not as a caregiver should. It's frightening how a caregiver could actually become offended by something somebody with dementia said to them instead of understanding, that they had dementia. And that was happening at the first place. So then I took her to the second place. And after a little while, a couple of years, she needed to be moved because she was misbehaving in a large number of ways, including theft from individual residents' rooms because for that they had her Afghan or they had her necklace. So
Mhm.
she was determined to take those things back to her room. So huge problems at the second place because they really were assisted living. They weren't memory care. They weren't equipped for it. And as disappointed as I was, because I was so comfortable with her being there, that they had to let her go. And when we brought her across the street to the extended care facility, which is part of the hospital, it didn't seem like she was going to be a good fit because she wasn't there yet. You know, she wasn't bedridden. She was very ambulatory. And they were positive they would be fine with her. And I got my eviction notice within 28 days.
Mm.
Yeah. She was going around into people's rooms because they were calling her in. She'd say hello and they'd call her in and she'd chat with them. And then they would say, hey, disconnect this. I don't like this alarm on the bed. It keeps going off. Nobody will turn it off for me. So my mother would. And that was what she did from room to room. And they called me and said, your mother's just happily going from room to room, disconnecting all of the bed alarms because it started with one and we can't have that. Of course they can't, you know?
Yeah. Oh
So
my gosh. I want to laugh because I think it's hysterical. But
now
on the other hand, at the time, it's like, oh my gosh. Yeah, totally.
when they called me, I was on speakerphone and they introduced themselves as, we have our whole committee here, Carolyn. We'd like to speak with you. You know, and oh, what's a whole committee doing on this, and telling me I'm on speakerphone. What's going on, And that's when they told me about the alarms. And then the final thing was the administrator said, and your mother came into my office and pooped in my garbage can. And I said, how can that be? And she said, well, I came back into my office. I had stepped out and there she was. And I said, she did that on purpose? And she said, no, I asked her that. And I said, Faye, why did you just poop into my garbage can? And my mother said, because your door was open and this is the bathroom.
Mm.
So these are the things that your mother would be mortified if she ever thought that that would be a behavior she would exhibit in her later years. Oh, I can't imagine if my mother ever would have, what she would have thought if that had been told to her.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Terrible, terrible disease.
So then what happened?
We moved her to the next town south of us, which was heartbreaking for me because it was 40 miles, highway miles, deer miles,
Yes.
loops miles. It just became my Monday morning thing to do. And I'd go see my mom, then I'd go to Home Depot, go to Starbucks and get a coffee because we don't have one in our town, and then come home, usually cry all the way home. It just seemed like not seeing her for a solid week each time was enough to really see differences. But she was in a memory care unit. She was surrounded by people. And there was not one time that I dropped in that she was alone or didn't have a stuffed animal in her lap or Dolly, her doll, in her lap or was getting her nails done. It was a really good experience for me to see her that way. She was, living her life very quietly and still unhappily, mostly. I think my mother spent the last years of her life unhappily in such a confused state and an accusatory state of mind that it breaks my heart for her, to think that those were her last years. I was able to manage her quality of care, but I wasn't able to manage her quality of life.
Okay. And so then it was COVID.
I was in Florida. It was the very beginning of, it was the end of March. And COVID had just been talked about the beginning of March. And that, things weren't really happening yet. It was people were starting to wear masks. State hadn't shut down yet. Airlines hadn't shut down yet, but they were starting to limit their flights. And I got a phone call from the facility saying they think my mother had a stroke. She wasn't her chirpy self that morning, and she didn't seem to be able to move her one side. So I said, okay, I'm coming home. I called the airlines. I booked my flight for the next day and started scurrying around to get my place buttoned down and water shut off and water heater shut off. I had a winter place. And that night, I got a text from the airlines that my flight had been moved. And this went on. It was a move and then a cancellation, a move 2 more days and a cancellation, another move. It went on like this for days until finally I got a customer service. They got me rerouted. It had gone on for 5, I think, full days of delays. And each day I checked in and my mother was stable, but, I was pulling my hair out. I couldn't get a different airline. It didn't seem to matter. They were all New York had just shut down, no more flights going in and out. Idaho had just issued a stay-at-home warning. Florida was just designated a hot spot, and I was in Florida. So I flew through Minneapolis and then around to Spokane on this huge jet with 12 of us on it,
Mm.
just 12 people. When we got to Minneapolis, we sat there until midnight. We had to sit there till midnight because we had no pilot to take us from Minneapolis to Spokane, Washington. But I ended up getting there and I made it to the facility that first thing in the morning. They gloved me up, they gowned me up. We walked down the hallway into a room where my mother was in quarantine, and they let me in. And I sat there and I held her and I cried and I did all of the things. And Denise was waiting for me in the parking lot. She had come to the airport to get me because it's a 2-hour drive to our airport. And after about an hour, I hit the button like they instructed me to. And I said, okay, I'm ready to leave. And she said, okay, take everything off at the door, put it in the garbage, and let's go. I came out of the room and I said, okay, what time tomorrow can I come? How early? And she looked at me and said, this was the nurse. Well, you can't. And I said, what do you mean? She said, you can't come back. Didn't they tell you that? And I said, no, what are you talking about? She said, oh, this was your visit. You got one visit. You came from a hot spot. We can't afford to risk the lives of others. And I get that. I got that. I just wasn't prepared. I had no idea that this was going to happen. So I turned around and I went back in her room and I sat in there and she bopped her head in and she said, it's time. You have to leave. So I came out and I left and I spent the next week again, this was going on. I spent the next week outside of her window looking in because they wouldn't let me in. So I would stand there with my hands up to the glass with the water dripping off the eave down into my back of my coat because it was winter time or early spring and just stare at her. Then they let us do FaceTime, but there was no talking to my mother because she was just laying there with her eyes closed. So they would hold the iPad up to her face so that I could look at her and just tell her I loved her. Until one day my phone rang and it was a doctor from the facility who said, hi, this is Dr. Christensen. And I'm just calling to tell you last night they tried to give your mother an IV and they couldn't. They couldn't find a vein. And I said, Dr. Christensen, I have an order that says no IVs, no medicines. And he said, no, this is just hydration. And that doesn't qualify. That's different. And I said, please don't have them put another needle in her. And he said, okay, I can do that. And I said, is this your opinion that we're at the end now? And he said, yes, it is. And I said, can I please come see her? Please let me come see her. And he was quiet for a second. He said, what do you mean? You haven't been able to come see her? And I said, no, they have not let me back since my first visit last week. And he said, hold on a second. And he came back to the phone and he said, by all means, you could come back and see your mother. Please come now. I don't think I even turned the coffee pot on or off. I didn't brush my teeth. It was morning. I just grabbed some pants. I don't know how I got from Bonners Ferry to Sandpoint, Idaho. I just appeared miraculously at that back door, gowned me up again, gloves, hat, and everything. And I went to the door with the same nurse. And she said to me, now, this is your last visit. So stay in there for as long as you need to, because when you come out, we can't let you back in. I went in there and I stayed there for 72 hours. I stayed with her. I talked with her. I had no phone. I had nothing to change into. My boots and my coat were out front in the front area of the facility. And I was able to be with her during her final. for hours. It was horrible. And I was the lucky one. I was one of the
Mhm.
ones who got to be with her. All these people that we read about and we saw on Facebook who weren't even able to be with their spouse, their parent, or their child. Heartbreaking.
Yeah. Brutal. Brutal. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's a long story. It's all these
Y-
details.
No,
I
but
did
it's
put them all in the book.
Yes,
yeah.
you have to read it in the book.
Yeah.
It was just couldn't stop. Yeah, you just can't stop. You have
Yeah.
to read the whole thing.
It was a terrible thing for anybody to go through. Just terrible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the end, they were so lovely. When they came in and I finally called them in, and I had to go into the bathroom every single time a nurse came in. That was the agreement we had for the 72 hours that I was there. When I finally told them I wasn't leaving, they called the hospital administrator, and the agreement was I would stay in the bathroom every time a nurse or an orderly came in
Sure.
and then come out when they left. That was our way of somehow protecting each other from getting my potential COVID from having traveled.
So she did then actually have a stroke. Do you know that that was the case? She did?
Yeah, it was evident. Her left side was
Yeah.
affected completely.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. That just sounds
Mm.
so devastating, the whole thing. It's such an awful time. And
It's awful for everyone. I will never claim to have had it worse than anyone else because the stories that I hear from so many people now, people send me emails through my website. I've had comments at talks that I've given. Somebody always wants to pull me aside and say, this is what's happening to me. And I'll listen and I'll think, yeah, that's pretty much what happened to me. And the 12 people before you that came to me, it's just absolutely horrific what this disease does to people, to the caregiver and to the person afflicted with it.
absolutely. I think that's one of the beauties of Al's authors is that we have these chronicles now of what life has been like for so many people in so many different circumstances. I think what's really important about your book is you and a couple of our other newer authors just chronicling this time period in history that was so different and so devastating for so many people. But that human story of like just watching your mom go through these different stages due to a disease that we don't know enough about and can't really control or cure. And it changes us. It definitely changes our person. So I guess that's the question I have for you is how has this experience of going through this with your mom and then writing the story, how has this changed you?
When I wrote the book, I thought I was writing it for people who were feeling alone. And I wanted them to know that, no, you're not alone, that others have gone through this just like you. You're going to be okay and hang in there. And then later, I realized that, yeah, that was part of it. But really, what I think I would like my reader to feel is encouragement toward being more loving during this process. We get caught up in the day to day business of taking care of business. We have schedules to maintain. We've got clothes to get them to put on. We've got to get them fed. We've got to get them cared for. And we've got to live our own lives. Did we plan for this new person that needs our help in ways that we don't even know how to help them? We didn't. We didn't ask for it. And here it is. It's in our laps now while we're trying to maintain our own relationships and our own careers and our own families, right? So it's so easy to get caught up in the responsibility, I think, of caregiving, that obligation. And it's hard not to be resentful. And I think what I really learned from this whole thing is trying to find the humor and the spirit of actual loving this person who has become oftentimes unlovable. Oftentimes they show you their ugliest self, and it's hard. I mean, it's the human condition to defend yourself, against this moral attack they're putting out towards you. And I think that I have learned to try to take that little step back and maybe ask myself, what's going on with them today? What's happening that's making this person behave in a way that is not the person I'm used to. And then trying to find a way to get over that initial feeling of wanting to say, hey, I didn't deserve that, knock it off kind of thing. So I think that's where I'm at these days is, you know, find that love, you know, find that love. It's because your person was that loving person that you fell in love with. I fell in love with my mother from my very earliest age. She was my hero. And I learned all of the good things from her. To this day, I talk about all of the good things I learned from my mother. Yet, those last years caring for her were filled with disappointment and resentment toward her because of this new person she had become that I didn't recognize anymore. And you really have to dig deep.
How have your siblings responded to the book?
About the same way as they did while I was caring for my mom. I guess
Have they read it?
I'd like to say yes. And they got an autographed copy.
Of course they did. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you come prepared to read something from the book?
Oh, well, I do have it here.
Beautiful.
I know, I love the cover.
I guess I could just start with the first couple of sentences.
Okay.
Well, to me, this is the funniest part from the very first paragraph entitled, She Was Just Getting Old. And it's year 1, stage 2, age-associated memory impairment. Morning, ma'am. This is Lieutenant Davy from Franklin County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about your mother. It was 5 a.m. Idaho time, too early for my alarm clock and birds, really. The room was black, and I had just been jarred awake by the insistent shrill of my phone, setting every nerve in my body on high alert. We're real worried about her. Been getting calls about her driving on the wrong side of the road, cutting people off, that sort of thing. He began recounting each of the complaints he'd recently received as I blinked my eyes into focus and forced myself to concentrate. Well, could you pull her over next time? Maybe give her a ticket? Can you take away her license or something? No, ma'am. Can't do that until I see her do it myself. I was hoping you could talk to her. I lived 3,000 miles away from my mother's rural North Georgia town where she lived by herself, a fiercely independent and very proud 79-year-old. I knew exactly how that call from me would be received. Hey, Mom, I heard you've been driving erratically these days. Seems you're causing a lot of concern around town. Maybe it's time for you to give up your driver's license. Where did I hear that? Oh, from your town sheriff, who heard it from your friends and neighbors. It took me 3 short seconds to consider the repercussions of making a call like that, leaving no doubt in my mind that things were just going to have to work themselves out without my help.
That was great. I mean, it definitely gives a flavor of your writing, which is
Exactly.
beautiful. It's beautiful.
Well, you get a call from your sheriff and he's telling you to call your mother and tell her that, he's just been tattled on.
Yeah.
On her friends and neighbors, I'm sure that would have just gone over.
It's like nobody knew what to do in the situation.
Right. He
All
wanted
the
me-
levels.
I wanted him to do something.
He didn't know how to handle the situation because he would have understood that there were,
No, absolutely
that
not.
wasn't going to work. Yeah. So how do people find you on social media, on the web? Got a
Yeah.
website?
I have a website, Birrell.com. I also have a Facebook page, author Carolyn Birrell. I also have an Instagram account, author Carolyn Birrell. You can find me on Goodreads. And of course, the book is on Amazon. You can order it from your local bookstore. You can also go straight to the library. You can just ask the library to order your book interlibrary loan for you. And it's kind of cool because I get reports from my library here in town when they get an order for an interlibrary loan. The other day I was like, hey, somebody from Iowa just ordered your book. And they did it across and send it back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's It looks like you have paper book, hardcover, a Kindle, which is awesome also, and an audiobook. So that's fantastic.
I did have somebody narrate my book for me. I had 15 different auditioners, and then I sent the top 3 around to my friends. And almost unanimously, my friends chose a narrator that wasn't my first choice.
Yeah.
So I chose the one that my friends all took. I assumed there was a safety in numbers kind of thing.
But that's so important, I think, for caregivers because podcasts like this and audiobooks are so helpful because we might be going from one place to the other. And so sitting down to a book might be a little hard, but we want to engage with authors like you who can tell us about their story and
Right.
some hope and some insight. So it's fantastic. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. Is there anything else you would like to tell the listeners before we say goodbye?
Yeah, hang in there. These cliche sentences. Sometimes I feel like there isn't anything that is going to be poignant enough to really strike that chord, in somebody's heart that's going through something like this at the time that they're going through it. Maybe really what I would say is don't stop talking about it, whether it's to a friend, if you go to church, your pastor, your doctor. If you would rather do it with a stranger, call the 800 number with Alzheimer's Association. They're open 24 hours a day. You can pick up that phone at 3 in the morning and talk to somebody. If you don't want to have your family business shared with somebody, whatever it is, just don't stop. Don't stop talking about it because there are people that can help you in some small way.
That's a great message.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. And yeah, I really appreciate your comments.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it, you guys.
Hi, it's Marianne with exciting news. Alls Authors has published a brand new anthology, Poetry for the Dementia Journey, now available in ebook and paperback through Amazon. Within its pages, you'll discover a variety of voices writing about the diversity of dementia care experiences, caring for a mother or father or spouse, witnessing the decline of a sibling, reflections on the time before the diagnosis, the years of care, and the aftermath. Poetry provides us with a meaningful way to explore our experience and emotions regarding dementia and to express ourselves when we encounter the many different joys and dilemmas caregiving can bring. You'll find details on how to order the book in the show notes. Please remember to leave a review on the book sales page once you've read it. Reviews do help boost a book's visibility and helps readers find it. Thank you for your support of our efforts to erase the silence and stigma that often accompany a dementia diagnosis.
Caregiving is a challenge, whether your person has dementia or not. Finding helpful tips and learning new strategies from people in the know is critical. That's why we at Alls Authors love the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast from Elizabeth Miller, who also happens to be an Alls author. Elizabeth speaks from experience and has important and often fun conversations with other caregiving experts and professionals. And we appreciate learning tips on self-care, discovering new resources, and feeling empowered to support ourselves as caregivers. You can find the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast wherever you download your favorite podcasts, or visit the website happyhealthycaregiver.com.